Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm speaking to a journalist and author whose latest book tells a real-life story that is about as human risk relevant as it gets. The tale begins with a cyber attack, but then moves into money laundering, data leaks, a bank heist, and disinformation campaigns. If I then tell you that the group behind all these things is suspected of having links to North Korea, you'll get the idea of what we're dealing with. My guest, Geoff White, is a journalist, author, and podcaster who's interested in exploring underworld industries. I'll let him explain what that means. Geoff's new book, The Lazarus Heist, begins with the 2014 hacking of Sony Pictures by a cabal of hackers with suspected links to North Korea. Over several years, Geoff follows them as they engage in even more shocking acts. It's a 21st century tale that contains a huge number of incredibly surprising elements. In our discussion, we explore how Geoff came to investigate the story, how he went about researching it, and the sometimes surprising lessons he's learned from doing so. We also explore some of the dynamics of the issues the story raises, including cybercrime, money laundering, and electronic warfare. What you're about to hear is an astonishing tale that I know you're going to find fascinating. So please enjoy my conversation with Geoff White on the Lazarus Heist. Geoff, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm really excited because you have a fabulous story to tell. But before we get on to that, can we talk a little bit about you and tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and what piques your journalistic interest?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an author and investigative journalist, and I generally cover cybercrime, high-tech crime, that kind of thing. But also I've covered things like personal data, I've covered internet dating, covered internet pornography. So it's all tech-related. And I guess the thing that I'm really interested in is what I call underworld industries. So I'm fascinated by the idea that there are industries out there that work very much in the shadows, but are complete industries back to back. So if you look at computer hacking, we obviously talk a lot about that in this podcast. One of the interesting things about that is the cliche that, you know, your mum and dad might have, you know, some hacker in a hoodie in a basement somewhere working on his own or her own, you know, usually his own, let's face it. That is completely out with the truth. Most of these hacking gangs are very well organized. It's a shadow industry. You know, they have, if you look at the Conti ransomware gang, we've had some leaks from inside the Conti ransomware gang recently, believed to be Russian origin. And they're a company. They have an HR function. They have an interview panel who interviews people. They have a salary people who pay people off. Marketing. It's almost like that thing, Stranger Things, that Netflix series, Stranger Things, where they have a sort of underworld, netherworld in this sort of horror thriller plot, and it's a mirror image of the world above. So it has shopping malls and it has houses and garages and, you know, shops and businesses. But it's the netherworld, the underworld side of that. And I'm just fascinated by businesses that work like that. How do these people get together? How do they pay each other off? How do they work together? I just find that sort of fascinating.
A really, really interesting sort of depiction of this world that the rest of us doesn't see. And so you sort of scratch with the surface. And the story that you write about in the book starts with a story that we've all heard of, which was around a movie. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came across that story and why that was interesting to pursue?
Yeah, well, this was huge breaking news at the time. This was 2014. Sony Pictures Entertainment got hacked. And to be honest, Sony would have very much struggled to keep that hack quiet. The hack was incredibly damaging to the company. Computer systems were taken offline. Thousands of computers had to be disconnected to prevent the spread of the virus. The company was forced back to paper and pens. I mean, it was devastating. Even the coffee shop that was attached to Sony Pictures Entertainment that was in the car park, their systems went offline. It was doors didn't work. You couldn't open the doors with your cars. You know, the whole thing just went offline. So this story started leaking out because obviously, you know, thousands of employees were affected. They're not all going to stay quiet and not speak to the media. So news of the Sony hack started to spread. And it was only, obviously now we can look back in hindsight and piece this together. But at the time, the hack happened. And then subsequently, over months, it started to be attributed to North Korea and to North Korea's government hackers, nicknamed the Lazarus Group. And the reason it was alleged that North Korea broke into Sony Pictures Entertainment was because Sony had made a movie called The Interview, the plot of which involves a couple of bumbling journalists going to North Korea and getting involved in a plot to assassinate Kim Jong-un and ultimately successfully assassinating him. And that's depicted in the film in quite graphic detail. This, as you can imagine, did not go down well in Pyongyang. It is hard to overstate how the leader Kim Jong-un and his heirs are regarded. They are basically like gods, and so what you've shown in that film is God being killed. That is an incredibly inflammatory thing. Some would argue that's a good thing, and you should prick the pomposity of leaders like Kim Jong-un, but it upset Pyongyang immensely. And so that's the idea, that they hacked into Sony and basically brought the company to its knees, and then started leaking incredibly sensitive information out of Sony. Every work email that everybody sent, but both internally in Sony and to outside clients as well, was just dumped online. It was absolutely horrific experience for Sony, and that really put the Lazarus Group hackers on the map.
And it's fascinating when you talk about the nature of leaks, because it shows a real understanding of what's going to cause pain.
Yes.
And the way, so this brings us back to your professionalization. It's not just we have the technological capabilities, but we've worked out how we can maximize the data that's in the organization.
Exactly. And looking back on the Sony attack, and again, this wasn't obvious at the time. I was at Channel 4 News at the time. We were covering it. So this only really emerged in hindsight as we've looked back at it. The hackers, as I say, hacked a whole bunch of information inside Sony, particularly the internal emails, but they didn't just dump all that online for, in one big wodge. They broke it up into, I think, 8 different chunks. They then sent those chunks out, sometimes to journalists directly. They were exhorting journalists to cover this stuff. And they'd say to journalists, you should look at this data dump. It's got this in it. It's got that in it. You could get this story out of it. So they were all sort of grooming journalists in a way as to which stories to cover. And what was remarkable, absolutely remarkable in hindsight, was the building that went on in that PR campaign. It's an anti-PR campaign, a negative PR campaign. And they built it up in the same way you would do with PR. You want to bring your PR campaign to a crescendo, at your product launch. Well, the crescendo for the hackers was leaking the information of the 2 people who ran Sony Pictures Entertainment, Michael Linton and Amy Pascal. They were going to be the sort of the culmination. They were going to be decapitated, career-wise, by the final leak of their information. Didn't quite work out like that for reasons you can read about in the book. But the cynicism and the planning and the execution of that negative PR campaign, the hack and dump campaign, was really astonishing. And if this is the work of North Korea, then that really speaks volumes about the extent to which, particularly at that time in 2014, we underestimated, I think, the prowess of North Korea's hackers and their ability to read the public sentiment and to take part in those hack and dump exercises.
And so you've got this big incident involving the movie studio that then morphs into something that is itself movie worthy. Can you talk where does the investigative trail take you there, and how do you start to think about this as a bigger story?
Well, yes. So after Sony's late 2014, I think November 2014 was when the hack was actually announced. They'd actually been inside Sony for several months, which is often the case with hacking. Sony were unaware that their networks have been penetrated. So beginning of 2015, the Sony fallout is still happening. The US has accused North Korea of carrying out the attack. North Korea denies this, by the way. But what's remarkable is the same group of hackers, it seems, were already onto their next target. And instead of attacking a movie studio, they were going to go on and attack a bank. And not just any bank. This is Bangladesh Bank, the central financial institution of that country. So it sits on billions of dollars. And obviously Bangladesh, millions of people there live in poverty. It's a country that is in deep need of every resource it can get. And the hackers went after it and attempted to steal $1 billion from that country. Absolutely astonishing.
And so as you're investigating this and sort of piecing together, clearly this isn't something where someone's laying a nice sort of audit trail for you. You're having to sort of use your initiative and think, how do you start to get a handle on that? Is it a combination of tip-offs? What's the process?
It's interesting. So the frustrating thing about cybercrime, and the reason cybercrime, I think, struggles to get mainstream news traction, is that you have a big bang at the beginning. As I say, Sony's a classic example. Big bang, Sony is hacked. Oh my God, Sony hacked. And that lasts for a couple of days, and then the news media gets bored and goes somewhere else. It's only subsequently the investigation happens, and it takes a long time forensically to investigate and to put all the pieces together. And so it took years after the Sony attack, the Bangladesh Bank attack, and the other ones that we'll come on to talk about, for the full detail to emerge. And that emerged really in 2 ways. Number one, in the Bangladesh Bank case, Bangladesh Bank having been attempted rip-off of $951 million, the hackers actually got far less money than that, but we can explain that later, and that's obviously covered in the book. But, Bangladesh Bank got taken for a lot of money and sued everybody, basically. But the Bangladesh Bank court case was, I think, 45 different entities, that it was suing to get its money back. And in that Bangladesh Bank court document is loads of detail about what happened. The other thing that fed into this was the US Department of Justice in 2018, so this is 4 years after Sony and a good few years after Bangladesh Bank, unsealed a criminal complaint against a chap called Pak Jin Hyok, who they claim is a key member of the Lazarus Group hackers alleged to work for the North Korean government. And that was full of immense detail. It's 178 pages, that in criminal complaint. And what's interesting about these documents is you go through them, and firstly, that's your first step. I think most journalists don't, because it's an intimidating document to go through. And secondly, it takes a couple of readings through to kind of work out what's going on, because the people at the Department of Justice and the people at Bangladesh Bank, the lawyers who draw up these court cases, they're not looking to create a narrative. They're just looking to put their evidence and their side out of it. What I'm looking for is what happened? Can I piece it together? So after several readings, you start to think, and then that bit, and what they're saying is that bit happened. And then that's when they sent the email. So suddenly you can put together this breadcrumb trail. So that's one of the sort of big jobs for me as an investigative journalist, is to take these legal documents and these accusations and try and make them into a narrative. What you're then doing is trying to find people who are on the ground who saw this stuff happening at the time. So we were lucky enough to interview the guy who wrote, one of the screenwriters of the interview, the actual movie, who was there obviously at the time, Sony employees who were there at the time, people who were inside Bangladesh Bank at the time. So having got my sort of ducks in a row as to what happened, what I'm then looking at, particularly for the podcast that we put out, the Lazarus Heist podcast, is people who can tell that story and had a ringside seat at that story. And those people sort of fill in the legal documents, if you like. Legal documents give you the bare skeleton. Those people, those interviewees, put the flesh on the bones. So they give you the emotion. And if you put those two things together, you can create the kind of compelling story that we've got in the podcast and now the Lazarus Heist book.
And what's interesting about this is it's insane, right? It sort of gets as the more one discovers, the more you just go, well, this is like much bigger than I was expecting. And that's one of the joys of reading it, right? Sort of and listening to the podcast. It sort of unfolds, and you're like, oh,
yes.
And you've got some lovely, clearly, it's nicely done in the sense of I do want to listen to the next episode because you've left me hanging as to where might this go. But it struck me as a balloon that was getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
yeah.
And one of the things I always struck me as being interesting in doing what you do is it presumably you need a sort of hypothesis, right? So a sense that this is worth investigating, and you're sort of a journalistic nose for these things. And then you have to, as you're piecing it together, logically, you're sort of, I'm assuming you're forming a kind of, well, this is where it looks like it's going. And that sort of determines, I guess, where you go. And then presumably when you're having these discussions with people, that can waylay you somewhat or throw you into a different sense. So it must be it's sort of interesting. In the one hand, you think you know where you're going. On the other hand, I'm guessing that some of the details you come across is like, oh, okay, we now need to go off into this side alley or have a look at this or investigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that happens in a couple of different ways. So for a start, doing a podcast and doing a book are very different propositions. And look, if you listen to the podcast, the book has got loads more in it and lots of different stuff in it. And that's partly because obviously lots more happened. I mean, the podcast series 1 of the Lazarus Heist stops in 2017. Happy to say there's going to be another series of the podcast out later this year that will pick it up. But the book includes all the stuff that happened really post 2017. So there's lots of fresh content in there. But also for the podcast, what makes the podcast is the interviewees. As I say, you need somebody who had a ringside seat. And if somebody's got a ringside seat at something, you just want to hear them. You just want to hear them tell that story. And so that dictates where you go with the podcast. The people with the best stories win. If somebody's got a great story to tell, it goes in the podcast. With the book, you can cover stuff that you couldn't cover in the podcast because you haven't got the interviewee to tell the tale. So there's stuff I've covered in the book, which I find fascinating, little quirks and twists, absolutely remarkable twists that I'm able to cover just because I can write them. I can just write it down. I'm not reliant on having to go off and speak to somebody. The other way you get sort of pulled around as a journalist, if you like, and pulled into different sides of the story is speaking to people and trying to establish what ground truth is. And that's a lot harder than you might think it is. So, for example, the US Department of Justice documents is their side of the story. Now, there is always a different side. There's the side of the person who's accused and is denying it. So you get their side of the story. But even stuff that seems fairly uncontentious, getting to the ground truth of it can be quite difficult. So as an example, when they broke into Bangladesh Bank, the hackers, for reasons that are outlined in the book, and it's a fascinating little quirk and a little twist in the story, they switch off the printer to basically cover their tracks so that nobody in the bank knows what they're doing, because the printer prints out records of the transactions, and if the hackers' transactions got printed out, the bank would have rumbled in. Now, Some reporting says that they disabled the printer so it didn't print anything. Some reports say that they disabled the printer so it only printed out blank pages. And I've had both sides from two people who are both very well informed, to the point where if one of them had told me one thing, I would have believed it. But then the other person tells me the other thing, and I think, well, he's also knows exactly what's going on. So just that little detail, it's like how do you actually get to the truth of something unless you've seen it and witnessed it with your own eyes? As a journalist, it's quite difficult sometimes just to get to the actual ground truth of something. And the third thing I'll throw in is stuff just happens. People come out the woodwork. So when we were recording the podcast, there was this enigmatic Japanese character, a guy called Tadashi Sasaki, who was just involved with the laundering of the money, ended up getting involved with the laundering of the money that was stolen from Bangladesh Bank through Sri Lanka. And this Tadashi guy, I just assumed was a complete fake. I just assumed he was fake name, fake IDs, fake emails. And then he pops up and it's like, oh, I'll do an interview with you. So we end up speaking to this guy and asking these questions. So stuff just, the wonderful thing about putting a podcast out is, particularly if you're doing a sort of rolling podcast, which we did with Lazarus Heist, there's two ways. You can put the whole podcast out at once and sort of stack and binge, the box set approach, or you can do it week by week. And the advantage of doing week by week is between one week and the other, things can happen. People come up and say, oh, I heard last week's episode, I've got this for you. So you can build on it. So that's the other way you get pulled around and your story gets twisted around as a journalist, twisted into different narratives.
And absolutely fascinating. And I mean, it strikes me that as you are investigating this, clearly there are people who have an interest in you not discovering the truth. So have you any sense of sort of misinformation being thrown your way? I guess in extremis, have you ever felt in danger as a result of what you're doing? How does that sort of, I'm not just telling, and this is you're not telling history from way back when, where there's no one will be bothered. Right, there is clearly a vested interest. If the theory is correct, there's a vested interest in making sure that Geoff doesn't get to the truth. Because then the game's up to a certain extent.
This is true. I mean, look, the story we're covering of Sony is a major media organization who put out a publication, the film, the interview that North Korea clearly didn't like, and the accusations that North Korea took them out. Now, the BBC and Penguin, who are publishing the book, are both major media organizations. We're putting something out, the book and the podcast, that North Korea probably don't like. Step 3 is the step we want to avoid. They're being taken out. We take it very, very seriously. We take information security very, very seriously. The BBC obviously isn't, and Penguin are not inexperienced in dealing with controversial stories. The useful thing about covering all these stories is we know what the MO is. We know how the hackers work. It is depressingly still phishing emails. That's the weapon of choice for a lot of these hacking groups. It's so often a phishing email. Increasingly using LinkedIn to approach people and making, saying, oh, I've got a great job for you, or, Geoff, do you want to speak at this conference? And then they send you the attachment that's got the virus inside it. So knowing the MO helps, and hopefully helps us avoid it. But it is always a risk, yeah. And in terms of people sort of stopping us trying to investigate, yeah, you're right. I imagine there are people out there who don't want us to investigate, and you do get shut down at certain points. But the useful thing is these incidents have happened. They are out there. I'm not. The Sony hack was public. The Bangladesh Bank hack was public. The WannaCry attack, which we haven't talked about, which was the ransomware attack in 2017, again attributed to North Korea, was huge. I mean, there's no way of avoiding WannaCry. It was all over the news. So in a way, I'm revealing things about stories, but the stories themselves have already been out there. So that's one thing to bear in mind, I suppose.
And I wonder whether any sense of sort of disinformation attempts, so pushing people towards you that are bearing false testimony, for want of a better phrase.
I don't think that's happened. I mean, we work like stink to get to these people. If there have been instances, not so much with this story, but there have been instances where I've thought, Christ, is this some huge stitch up where I've worked really hard to get this person, but they've made me work really hard so that I think that when I get them, they must be, somebody who's not being put up to the job, which sort of paranoia that kind of creeps in. I generally don't think we've been pushed disinformation, but one thing I will acknowledge, which is a slightly awkward thing, is a lot of the evidence about this and the accusations have come from the US government. Now, North Korea is still officially at war with the South and its allies, which includes the US government. There was a truce declared in the war in 1953, but they never stopped the actual war itself. And so North Korea's response to these accusations is to say, well, this is our enemy, our wartime enemy, smearing us and trying to slander us. And so, a lot of the stuff we've covered comes from the US government's documents, and we have to kind of look at that and think, well, what's the North Koreans' response to that? But I have to say, there is an army of security researchers and also people at the United Nations who are increasingly backing and supporting these claims. So it's not just the US government saying it anymore. It's multiple governments, multiple private companies, and as I say, to a certain extent, the United Nations with their reports. So,
you're feeling on relatively safe ground.
Relatively safe ground. I mean, and look, the US has put out, as I say, 178 pages in that one criminal complaint, let alone the hundreds of other pages in other criminal complaints. It is full of detail. Now, that detail comes from the US government. It is their accusation. But if North Korea wants to engage with that and rebut it, they need to do more than just say, "Oh, this is a smear job." You've got to actually confront the evidence and
a great counter argument.
You've got to actually take it blow by blow and say, "Well, that bit's not true, and our defense to this is this." Yeah.
And as you talk about these things, it's clearly what they're doing is stealing money from a bank on any sort of ethical level. It doesn't sound like a good thing to do. But to certainly, if one put oneself in the shoes of whoever is doing this, presumably North Korea, if you got sort of sneaking admiration for this, underpinning it all, where you sort of look at it and go, I don't like it, right? It's not why I wouldn't. Not something I would support, but they're damn good at this stuff.
It is very hard not to be impressed by, and I am impressed by I think two things: the ingenuity and creativity, and the tenacity. I think people have this idea with hackers that they have sort of godlike powers, that you type a few lines into a few lines of green text onto a black screen and I'm in. That's the hackers that I'm in, and they're crawling around. It's just bollocks. That it's not true. As a hacker, most of the time, from what I know of hacking, you break into somebody's system, you have no idea how it's set up. I've made the comparison in the book to it's like being a burglar dropped into a house you don't know with a particularly weak torch that's running out of batteries. At any moment, you don't know the layout of the house. You don't know where the furniture is. You don't know who's in the house and who's potentially going to spot you. So you're stumbling around. That's the hacking experience. And so to sort of feel your way around a network you don't know remotely through a computer, work out how it works, work out how to compromise it, and get away with that. That takes a tremendous amount of ingenuity and just creative thinking and what you might call remote thinking. You've got to think your way around somebody else's house or network, to ditch the analogy.
And you're doing it while they might detect you, so you're having to sort of snoop around.
Yeah, it's an amazing article written, it's going back a bit, but Julian Assange wrote an amazing article back before he was or before it all went wrong, where he talked about, he went under the hacker name Mendax, was his original hacker name, and he talked about breaking in somewhere. And it was the most amazing description because he's breaking in, and he said it was like being in an empty warehouse or an empty, estate or something at night, and you've got the place to yourself, and you're just, that thing where you've broken in somewhere. When you're a kid, you break in somewhere illicit, and you're wandering your way around.
I'm aware of that idea.
That idea. Yeah, do not recommend. And he talks about somebody spotting him, and he realizes that a security engineer, this is 2:00 in the morning, has somehow spotted that he's in the network and is trying to shut him out and also catch him. Because if you can catch the person who's hacking, you can get the evidence that their IP address, and this was the era when IP addresses sort of worked as a tracking tool. And so he described having to back out of this network that he was in, this sort of empty, warehouse he'd broken into, closing off all the doors and making sure he didn't leave any traces anywhere. And in a race against time against the guy, the security guard with the flashlight and the dog who was tracking it. Astonishing. And that suddenly opened my eyes to like what it's like as a hacker to sit on the other side. It's tense,
And it seemed to me that although on the one hand, they only have to get lucky once, that old adage, whereas the people trying to stop them have to be lucky all the time. But it seemed to me the nature of this was in a way that they're probably launching lots of different attacks, doing lots of things, some of which will never see the light of day because they will fail or won't. And so we might think of it as a sting operation here, but presumably underpinning that, for every one, let's make up a statistic now, but for every one that succeeds, maybe there's 20 or 30, whatever it is, that don't or are still in progress.
I think that's fair enough. And I would push back against this thing of, the hackers only have to be lucky once. You don't see all of the, you don't see all of the attempts that fail. It's like the thing when you've lost the keys and they're always in the last place you look. And it's like, well, yeah, because you don't then keep looking in loads of other places after you found them, do you? It's a fallacious kind of argument. They weren't the last place I looked. I kept looking in other places and they weren't there either, So yeah, the hackers only had to be right once because we think that's the one we notice. With Sony, for example, there were multiple attempts that didn't work to hack into Sony. With Bangladesh Bank, the emails went out. It's a phishing email that got sent to Bangladesh Bank employees. It wasn't just Bangladesh Bank. There were other entities in Bangladesh that received I think, the same phishing email. And they also went after other banks. They've gone after banks in lots of different countries around the world. And what's fascinating is I put together a list of all the different banks that they've been accused of breaking into. Some of them they didn't manage to get any money out of, but even the ones they did get money out of, let's look at Bangladesh Bank. They went after $951 million. It's a huge quantity of money. What they actually ended up with after, some of the transactions went wrong and got reversed after having to pay off the middlemen was in the tens of millions of dollars. And if you add up what they went after, the list I had, and this is a bit old now, but I will use it as an example. They went after $1.2 billion, and what they got was something like 120 million. So they got a tenth of what they went after. So it's not all bleak. There are, as you say, there are failed attempts that we don't see, and even when they do hack and they're successful, they don't always get the money that they want.
Yeah, which is interesting because it is viewed. We tend to look at these things in binary terms, right? It's either happened or it hasn't happened, and therefore that if I looked at that as a sort of rate of return, you might say, well, that's rubbish, right? 10%, terrible, useless. On the other hand, it's 10% of something that wasn't there before. Yeah. And possibly that's built into the quote unquote business model where you go, we'll get what we can.
Yes. And that's the thing, what's your upfront cost? It's a few hackers with a few laptops and an internet connection. And any money you can get in is worth doing. That's still 120 mil that's gone to a country that's under international financial sanctions. North Korea, you've got to realize, from my reading of the sanctions, it's almost difficult, almost impossible, I think, for North Korea to buy and sell anything. How do you function as a country if you can't sell stuff? That's the situation North Korea is in. At that stage, any money you can get in through the door is useful. North Korea's got a long history of sending workers overseas, and the accusation is those workers then are sort of forced to send their salaries back home. Well, if you're working in a North Korean restaurant in Europe somewhere, and you're sending back your wages back home, how much are you making? And how much is North Korea getting back from that? It's tiny amounts of money. But if you do it en masse, it makes enough money for you to prop up a country that is unable to prop itself up any other way.
One of the things I thought was fascinating in the sort of the story is the fact you reveal, and I've seen recent articles on this as well, that there are people who are acting on behalf of North Korea who, in simple terms, carry other passports. But have adopted other identities. And so there's quite a lot of, and it sounds to me like it goes beyond what one might term sort of normal espionage tactics. They have quite a sophisticated model of placing people in other countries to do, work under different guises.
Yes.
And deploying people to do particularly technology type labor in other countries. You talk a little bit about that, because it was another case of, this is bigger than I thought.
Yeah.
And of course, when you start to think about it from their perspective, why wouldn't they do that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I find this stuff fascinating, and it's sort of on the fringes of my experience because it gets into the sort of diplomacy kind of security type stuff people like Gordon Carrera at the BBC do. But I find it fascinating that when you send people overseas as a government, you obviously have a diplomatic function. So you give people a diplomatic passport, they go and work in an embassy. Some of those people will just be diplomatic people, they're issuing passports and they're dealing with, people from your country who get, in legal trouble overseas, like we have British embassies and stuff. Some of those people are spies. And there's just this sort of acknowledgement of, there's 100 people working in embassy of country X in London. 50 of them are probably spies. And we think we know which ones they are because our spies are keeping an eye on them. And whenever there's a diplomatic spat, as there has been recently with Russia, the visas, the diplomatic visas of the spy people are sort of revoked. It's like, well, no, you're not really diplomats, you were spies, and we knew all along, so we're getting rid of you. And I think to myself, well, why didn't you get rid of them? You knew they were spies. Why didn't you get rid of them before? But you hold them as like a playing card. It's like, well, we know who your spies are, and if things go wrong, we will eject them. Because also, that means your spies in the country that you've just ejected the spies of are also going to get ejected. So there's a tit for tat goes on. So North Korea's got an interesting example of this. It will, issue diplomatic passports to staff who can then travel abroad. Very, very rare perk in North Korea. Most North Koreans never get to travel abroad. Some of those people will be spies, but that's sort of par for the course. What North Korea apparently does, which is slightly different, is sending people abroad who aren't on diplomatic passports, who are sort of sent abroad as kind of workers, on workers' passports, workers' visas rather, to places like China. And those people are technically speaking employees of a particular company. They work for a tech company, but what they're doing is effectively spying and hacking and that kind of espionage work. Now, at that point, they are quite exposed, those people, because if you're a diplomat on a diplomatic passport and you're spying, you have a certain amount of protection. If it goes wrong, you will be ejected from the country, probably not prosecuted. So the Russians, for example, Russian spies allegedly got caught in The Hague. They were on diplomatic passports. They didn't get prosecuted and arrested. They got ejected from the country. The North Koreans working abroad, who aren't on diplomatic passports, but are on normal passports, but working overseas, if they're doing spying and they get caught, that's really risky for them because they don't have the diplomatic cover. There's also this issue of North Koreans being issued with other countries' passports. We know, for example, the half-brother of Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-nam, who was famously killed in Malaysia airport, in Kuala Lumpur airport, had been traveling previously on a Dominican Republic passport. So we know North Koreans were able to get different countries' passports. Some people I've spoken to say it's common for North Koreans to have Chinese passports. It just allows them to travel to more places. I mean, it's far less suspicious to travel on those places. So that whole diplomatic espionage type visa game is a really interesting one. I say it's on the fringe of my experience, but I do find it fascinating.
But I mean, it's directly relevant to the piece because one of the things that the points that you make is around if you want to do things using the internet, typically hacking involved these days. You're going to need to have internet access, and therefore they have to have people, and that's harder to do from North Korea.
Yeah.
Hence, put people into places like China, where they can have access to things they wouldn't. It's harder to get access to back at home.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's the thing. So North Korea obviously has limited travel connections to the outside world. The borders are mostly sealed, but also particularly in the COVID period as well. But also from an internet access point of view, North Korea has a very limited set of IP addresses and links to the outside world, mainly through sort of Russia and I think still China. There was also a joint venture with a Thai company at one stage. But look, they just don't have many lines to the outside world. So, and those lines are obviously incredibly highly surveilled. So there's a lot of sense sending your hackers over the border to somewhere like China, which has a huge amount of IP addresses, and you can sort of hide in amongst the crowd. So that's the technical reason. The more sort of philosophical and intriguing reason is if you're going to try and hack people and send them phishing emails, you have to understand what they respond to. And to do that, you have to understand how people think. And inside North Korea, inside that information bubble, that's going to be quite difficult to do. And so you'd send your hackers overseas and outside so that they're going to get the hang of how the internet works and what's going on so they can become more effective hackers and social engineers. And one of my favorite examples is the Sony case. One of the ways, ultimately unsuccessfully, they tried to get into Sony was by sending cast and crew of that film, The Interview, links on Facebook. And the links said, nude celebrity photos, click here for nude celebrity photos. Now, North Korea is an incredibly, quite a prudish society. Its social attitudes are very, very conservative. The idea of sending nude pictures of yourself would just be incalculably scandalous to a lot of North Koreans. The idea that was just going on in society is something you could only know if you were outside North Korea, because there had been nude celebrity photos leaked. It was called the Fappening. It had happened in 2014. It was big news. But you wouldn't know that from inside North Korea. You'd have to be outside North Korea to know that. And then you can use that as your phishing email lure. You go, there's this big story of nude celebrity photos leaks. We can use that as hackers. That's something you could only know if you had your finger on the pulse and were aware of those breaking stories.
And this is therefore much more sophisticated than some of those phishing attempts where you get, they deliberately include spelling mistakes to make sure that or sort of implausible emails to make sure the target audience they've got is already, and I'll be slightly unkind, gullible enough to take it.
Yeah.
This is quite sophisticated to start with. This is real proper targeting. It's that end of the spectrum.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when the US government investigated the email accounts that they alleged the North Korean hackers were using, so they were using Gmail and Twitter and Facebook to launch these attacks, which they're commodity technology. We all use them. It's handy. Unfortunately, they're all US companies, or fortunately for the US, they're all US companies. Unfortunately for the North Koreans, because that meant the US government could hit up Google, Alphabet as it's called now, Twitter, Facebook, or Meta as you call it now, with warrants to get access to these accounts. And what they found when they uncovered these Gmail accounts was they were full of addresses, email addresses for cast and crew from that film, The Interview, spelled in different ways. So that clearly whoever was trying to hack Sony was constantly trying to kind of work out what's the email address for, I don't know, James Franco, the star, or Seth Rogen, the star of The Interview, do different permutations of their address until you get the one that gets through to them. So yeah, it was very, very targeted attack.
And that's quite basic, right? When you talk in those terms, because you would that points to the point you're making around there's a lot of effort that goes into this, right? This isn't just someone quickly tapping at a keyboard and knows the magic unlock. It's like, it's literally battering the door down, let's keep trying time and time again in a very primitive way until we get lucky.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So going back to the story, I mean, you've got the heist on the radar, and then you mentioned WannaCry. It must be interesting as stuff is happening in the world, because this is running over several years now. Are you sort of constantly on the lookout for things? You see that maybe this is another one. How does the kind of the flow of information to you go?
It's got to that point, where particularly, as we'll come on to, I'm sure that the North Koreans have started targeting, being accused of targeting cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, etc., and stealing billions of dollars. It puts the amounts from Bangladesh Bank in the shade. And it has got to the point where every cryptocurrency attack that comes out, the suspicion is, well, I bet that's North Korean. I'm always the person on Twitter saying, wait, we've got to sort of see what the evidence is. I mean, the most recent one is a video game called Axie Infinity and the Ronin Bridge technology behind it that supported it, which is a cryptocurrency type game and a cryptocurrency piece of technology that it's alleged the North Koreans hacked into. Now, that was a theft of $625 million. It's eye-bleeding amount of money. I think, and I'm still waiting for somebody to prove me wrong on this, and I'm willing to be proved wrong, but I think it's the single biggest amount of money ever hacked in a single hack from one company. Obviously, people have made loads more money from multiple hacks, but a one-off, one-hit job, I think that's the biggest amount of money. And what's interesting about that is, obviously, at the time, it's like, I bet this is North Korea. Subsequently, the US government have said, we've looked at the Ethereum wallet into which the money was put, the cryptocurrency wallet, into which the stolen money went, and we have identified that as a North Korean government wallet. That's the US accusation. So, these attacks keep coming, but it's only in hindsight. It's really only in hindsight that you can actually attribute it and you get the attribution. For me, it's certainly the attribution I would feel comfortable with as a journalist.
Right, but it's sort of, you're alive to these things because you're thinking back to the point. These people are creative and I guess innovative, right? So you move from the move into crypto is a really good example of. Traditionally, we have to rob a bank if we want loads of money, because that's where there's lots of money. Now we have other opportunities, far more profitable, much more easy to handle. You don't have to worry about physical buildings.
Yes,
and there's lots more opportunities to do it. And of course, as these technologies evolve, there are more and more of these opportunities to manage that. And they are, I guess, back to your point around the sort of industrialization of these things. They're going to be at the cutting edge of this stuff because this is much more effective than traditional methods of getting hold of cash.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, banks became a harder target, I think, after the Bangladesh Bank job. SWIFT, which was the technology that was used to transfer money out from Bangladesh Bank and exists in almost every bank around the world, made a lot of measures to try and, make that more secure and also more difficult to use for hackers. So SWIFT got harder to use. Banks generally cracked down on their security. But the other thing is COVID happened. And one of the things about going back to the Bangladesh Bank job that was interesting was the number of accomplices around the world that they needed to execute that bank attack. You need people on the ground. You need people physically moving money, cash money around. And other hacks, I've talked about an amazing raid on Cosmos Bank in India, and also another raid on Malta, a bank in Malta called Bank of Valletta. Both of those hacks, and I've outlined them in the book because they are incredible hacks. But both of them relied on the ground people. Now, as COVID happens, that gets harder. Your people power diminishes. Borders get sealed off. People aren't moving around as much. They can't go and mule those amounts of money. So increasing that becomes digital. But also, as I say, banks get to be a harder target. At the same time, you get this growth, this massive growth in cryptocurrency. I think it was 2018 from memory when Bitcoin hit $20,000, a sudden spike. So cryptocurrency is not only increasing massively in value at different times and becoming a hot property, but the entire cryptocurrency industry, I think it's fair to say in most cases, is so much less regulated and therefore less well protected than traditional finance. So it's got a major advantage for a few reasons. Number one, it's rocketing in value. It's a good asset to have. Number two, it's less well protected than traditional banks. And number three, it's movable in so much more of an easier way than physical money. The Bangladesh Bank case, they ended up changing the money into Philippines pesos because they laundered it through the Philippines. That money was half a ton. It's 500 kilos of banknotes. That's a grand piano's worth of banknotes you got on your hands.
Well, you're not taking that in your hand luggage, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah. Hello. I think EasyJet would have some issues with that. Put it in the overhead locker.
Spend half of it on the luggage fees, right?
Can you imagine the stewardess going along, stashing bits of, having to move everybody else's bags around like they do?
Well, I'll tell you what is funny. So I used to fly from London to Zurich, this is a little side, from London to Zurich quite frequently. And there were certain people that you'd see sort of flying on Monday morning or Tuesday morning flights. And there was one that says, I was on the flight out of London City, which for listeners that aren't familiar with, it's a very small airport, so very small planes.
Tiny, yeah.
And there was the plane was full, and they did this kind of, some people are going to have to check their luggage in the hold. And someone arrived quite late with a bag that I think just about fit. And they tried to take it off him. And I've never seen anybody get more angry in their life about having this luggage removed. And so they said, what's in this bag? And he kind of wasn't, and so he panicked. And then as soon as we got to Zurich, he was like rushing out, trying to get out, trying to see this thing. And I wish I'd followed him because I'm pretty sure he was headed for the airport branch of one of the banks that are there.
Probably so, yeah.
Right, yeah. And it was just fascinating. So I think we sort of joke about it, but I'm pretty sure those limits that they put in passport control, and think, 10,000 or whatever it is, is there because there are people genuinely doing it.
Oh, yeah. And there's been multiple cases of not just North Koreans, but generally people sort of trying to smuggle huge amounts across. But yeah, as I say, during COVID, that all just gets much more difficult. I mean, that example, nobody's flying anymore. You can't get flights. You can't, so suddenly that physical money stuff gets harder. The virtual money stuff takes off, and the amounts that the North Koreans are alleged to have made from these cryptocurrency heists, it is absolutely eye-watering. You're talking about $2 billion, and that $2 billion figure is interesting because that's on the basis of the amounts that the cryptocurrencies were worth at the time of the theft. Now, just to put that in context, one of the cases we covered is a company called NiceHash in Slovenia. They're a cryptocurrency services company. They had, I think, $75 million stolen from them. It's a huge amount of money. Wow. And again, a hack attributed to the North Korean Lazarus group. A month later, I think that was worth something like 150 million, so doubled in value. And another month later, it was back down to 30 million. So this 2 billion figure that the North Koreans have stolen, is flexible, sometimes more, sometimes less. But over time, that 2 billion is just going to keep multiplying and multiplying. And they have trouble laundering that money because, as we know, cryptocurrency is traceable. All cryptocurrency transactions are recorded publicly in this thing called the blockchain, which is basically how cryptocurrency is able to exist because there's a public ledger of it. But that public ledger means it's easy to trace. You can track it down. So the North Koreans and others who are doing cryptocurrency theft have trouble laundering the money. But the longer it takes them to launder the money, the more the value of that asset appreciates. So in a way, laundering it bit by bit over time is like a high interest bank account. Each time you take it out, it's worth a bit more money. So fascinating story. And again, we'll go into that in the book, and we'll go into that in the second series of the podcast in quite a lot of depth.
But all of this, again, points to that logistical challenge. Right? This isn't a sort of straightforward, because I think when one thinks about it in primitive terms, it's kind of, money gets stolen and gets used. And you've rightly pointed out there's a whole load of movable feasts here. And a logistics operation behind the scenes that requires quite careful thought around how you handle it, and particularly that transition point into. And I guess it's going to be easier through as the metaverse, there are potentially more opportunities to spend cryptocurrency. But in simple terms, you're going to have to convert it back into sort of physical cash at some point at the moment, and therefore to get out of that traceability piece. And so that requires, again, logistical operations that point to what you were saying about, a sort of dark industrialization, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. So if you look at sort of North Korea and accusations against it as a sort of microcosm of this, look, broadly speaking, here's the situation. North Korea gets hit with sanctions because it keeps testing nuclear weapons and missiles. Sanctions cut it off from the international financial community. North Korea's hackers then have to top up the government's coffers by hacking. That's the accusation. What that's led to, and it's as a result of the sanctions, and I don't like this because it's an inconvenient truth, this one, has led North Korea into, it seems, a path of crime and led it to collaborate with an international network of criminal collaborators. So all the people who collaborated with it, a lot of them on the Bangladesh bank heist, either were criminals or were turning a blind eye to the obvious criminality. They've worked with money mule herders and money mule financial crime operatives in the US. There's an incredible story around the network there that, in a bizarre twist, leads to an Instagram influencer who's got 2.3 million Instagram followers. Again, another really weird twist in the story. But they've got this entire network of sort of criminal accomplices. And what for me, what's at the heart of the North Korean story and the Lazarus Heist story is this really interesting trend of collaboration between government hackers, nation-state hackers, and organized cybercrime and organized crime. Now, the reason that's worrying and the reason we need to pay attention to that is the governments have the money and the people and the time. The organized crime gangs have the networks And their organized crime approach is spray and pray. The organized cybercrime approach is hit them and hope. Hit as many targets as you can, sort them out later. We hit 1 million people, we steal a fiver, we've got 5 million quid. Bada boom. Most of those victims aren't even going to report that theft if they even notice it. That's the model of organized cybercrime. If you put that together with the stealthy, well-resourced threat from nation states, you've got a problem. And I think that's the problem we're going to have to confront. And by the way, if you want to look at an example of that, SolarWinds, one of the big hacks from earlier this year, late last year, SolarWinds was that. It was the organized cybercrime approach, hit them and hope, but with, according to the US government, the resources of the Russian Federation behind it. That's where that ends up.
So the simple analysis that you outline is the more these sanctions bite, the more we're incentivizing that behavior, right? Because
it's the risk, yeah. And that's what, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia, it's going to be super fascinating to see where that goes. I mean, Russia has a very well-developed cybercrime economy, possibly the most well-developed in the world, certainly been around for a very long time. There are sanctions on Russia. Those sanctions are different to North Korean sanctions. They're individuals and entities rather than countrywide. But nonetheless, there are sanctions on Russia. It's going to be fascinating to see how the cybercrime economy responds to those sanctions. And as they look at the North Korean model, the accusation is that the sanctions drove North Korea into cybercrime, and the cybercrime ended up crossing over into organized criminal elements. How does that relate to Russia? How does that play out? So it's going to be really interesting to sort of see that one.
And I mean, on the Russian piece, it seems to me as a sort of outside observer that they don't seem to have struck with that particular. People talk a lot about their capability. We don't seem to have seen that, for want of a better phrase, cyber war kicking in. Now that may be naivety, and to your point, right? It may be invisible, but I sort of we haven't had any great story. There hasn't been a kind of Sony hack type story where we could pin it on the Russians. And actually, given they are public enemy number one, you might almost expect that would be a better way to attack the West than with tanks they maybe don't have or don't want to provoke that physical thing. So to a certain extent, I was expecting to see the kinds of stories that you talk about with a Russian tinge.
Yes, it's interesting. It's very interesting, this, and the whole we haven't had a cyber war in Ukraine kind of thing. I will push back slightly on that, because people look at offensive cyber war and they look at the offensive side. We haven't had cyber war offensives from Russia. What they neglect is the massive amount of cyber war defense that's been going on. The UK and its allies have been doing a huge amount of work helping Ukraine to defend against those attacks. That's one thing I'd say. Second thing is there has been a pretty constant cyber war against Ukraine and from Ukraine back against Russia for years, since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and a bit before. So, stuff that we don't see as cyber war, because it's just ongoing conflict. So there's that element to it as well. Other element to throw in is there may have been attacks that we don't know about. I mean, Ukraine is a country that we support, but it's quite a secretive, can be quite a secretive country. They're not necessarily telling us about the awful things that have happened in terms of cyber. The other thing is Russia is bogged down in a horrific ground war. Does it have the resources and capability to put its hackers and techies onto cyber attacks, or is it directing them to try and jam the signals of and interfere with the communications of its enemies? I suspect its hackers are more readily applied there. The other thing I'd throw into the mix is Russia, certainly in the short to medium term, I suspect was going to have to occupy Ukraine and was preparing for that. Do you want to take down the infrastructure of a country that you then have to then go on and occupy? That's awkward and tricky. So there's lots of different things. Right. And also, we are starting to see cyber attacks on Western companies. I mean, Coca-Cola got attacked, allegedly by a Russian aligned group, a Russian cybercrime group. So, we are seeing cyber attacks leaking out into the West. We haven't seen the big WannaCry type attack, and I don't know whether we will, but we are starting to see hacking groups from inside Russia launching sort of, if you like, patriotic attacks on big Western targets and making wins. So, but you're right. Look, we haven't seen the massive big cyber war that everybody's expecting, but we are seeing cyber war, to make that clear, I think. And
it's interesting actually when you make that comment, because clearly you're spending your time looking at this subject, and I have a kind of what I'd term peripheral interest in it, that I will absolutely leap on stories I discover, but I'm probably not trawling looking for them on a daily basis. And so for me, it has to sort of hit the mainstream media, and it might be in a corner of it, but I'll go after it. What's your sense on the sort of public interest on this? Are there certain things that, Sony would be a good example. You could understand why that piques people's interest, because partly because literally the drama associated with it. But are there dynamics where things that you find fascinating and interesting that sort of don't resonate with the public?
Yeah, and there's multiple different reasons for that. I mean, having worked, work across TV, audio, and text. So, video, audio, and text is what I do, which is a useful thing as being a freelance. And what I find interesting is that, the vast majority of cybercrime stories and cybersecurity stories, there is no picture. There's nothing to film. There's there's somebody at a keyboard. Well, okay. Well, how does that, tell a story? If you're getting pictures of, as we have tragically from Ukraine, things blowing up, that's always going to lead the TV news. It's always going to get higher in the agenda. So that's what's been interesting about working on a podcast and now on the book is being able to finally tell the stories, because you don't need the picture. I constantly fought at Channel 4 News to try and get this stuff on air, and they were saying, well, where's the picture? How do we illustrate this? And you come up with these awful crap analogies for technology stuff that you try and film and they never quite work out. So my favorite one being, we tried to illustrate a denial of service attack by using the analogy of a barman at a bar being inundated with orders from customers for requests, and finally the bar shuts down. That was a filming opportunity from hell. But
I just love that. Okay, I totally get it though. It makes perfect sense. And I can sort of see you go, I've got to get some visuals here to sell this story.
Yeah, how do we do this? So we've spent an hour in a bar, and nobody could drink alcohol because it's during workday. We all, so it's the world's most boring bar gets inundated with orders for cranberry juice. God, that takes me back. But no, so yeah, it struggles to get in front of audiences. And the other thing I would point out is, going back to my earlier point, it's often only in hindsight that we piece these things together. It takes time for the investigators to work. It takes time for us as journalists to get our heads around it. And so that's why, for me, cybercrime and cybersecurity is so ripe for investigative journalism and long-term, long-form investigative journalism, because it's difficult to explain. You need a bit of time to explain it. You need a bit of time to understand it. But what's brilliant, the Lazarus Heist podcast was the number one podcast in the UK. We beat Line of Duty, the Line of Duty podcast. This is an investigative documentary about North Korean computer hacking, and it's number one.
Right,
millions of downloads we're talking. Clearly, people want to know about this. Clearly, they're interested. They're just looking for the right story and the right way in. So that was very gratifying in terms of a journalist trying to be able to tell the story.
And is there a challenge now in terms of the way journalism is shifting? There's a lot more focus, sort of breaking news, celebrity gossip, short attention spans. And yet my sense is there are examples of a sort of, slow, to use the tortoise phrase, slow news. Sort of proper investigation. There still seems to be a huge appetite for that. And so it seemed to me that we have to pay for it, obviously, but this pervasive narrative of, well, people have very short attention spans, you can't hold them for long periods of time. You're undermining that in many respects with what you're putting out there, because people genuinely are curious about this.
Yeah. One of the sort of mega trends of technology, and one of the things technology does very well, is it burns the middle ground. So look at music, for example. If you're the Rolling Stones or the Red Hot Chili Peppers, you fill a stadium, you do loads of merch, you get loads of support, it's fine. If you're a startup band, if you're, four mates in a garage, you've got so many opportunities. You can go on YouTube, you can do this, you can get, get there, you've got all this social media stuff. The middle ground of being, playing those smaller venues and kind of getting paid a bit, but not much, that middle ground is that's what technology burns, in my experience. And I think it's a bit the same in journalism. What journalism used to do, and what our task was we turned up because you couldn't. We turned up because you can't be bothered. And you see the Pathé newsreel. Pathé newsreel's classic. The Queen arrives, looking radiant, and there's a picture of the Queen get off a plane. She met some of the locals, and there's a Queen shaking hands awkwardly with some people. And that's, you can't be there. We are. We show you. The Queen. We literally show you what was there. These days, you've got Facebook Live. You want to see William and Kate arriving in Kenya, I think it was. Facebook Live, it's fine. It's all streamed, that they're streaming it. We don't need that anymore. And so I think that the task of journalism has got two things. Number one, breaking news, as you say, there is this febrile, fast turnaround, get it before everybody else, pop up on the feed stuff. But at the other end, there's this interest in longer form investigative journalism, in detail, in analysis, because that sort of helps people fill in the gaps that they feel they're missing from this sort of constant, surface news. So I do think there's that hunger there, and I think that's what the service we perform as a journalist, I think, is to analyze stuff. If you know your stuff, you can analyze. And if you investigate stuff and you reveal stuff which is meant to be hidden and supposed to be hidden, those are your two tasks, I think, as a journalist. For me, I feel like we're no longer in the game, or shouldn't any longer be in the game of just turning up and saying what we saw, what happened. There's a role for that, but I think longer term, it's analysis and investigation is, I think, the way to go. I feel, for me.
But it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's very easy to run a sort of light news program where you don't really get into anything in any great detail. Blather, you could almost sort of put anyone up there blathering their way through it. And actually, if you're a subject matter expert, you're going to need a bit more time to tell the story because you recognise it's complex. Yeah. And actually, if I really do want to know about something, that 30-second snippet I might get isn't going to satisfy me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the same. I still love the headlines. I still, I will tune in every hour for the headline just to hear what the breaking line is.
In case something's changed. Right?
In case North Korea's hacked something else. But I do want. And what's nice about how would I put it? New media, to use the phrase, awful phrase, hackneyed, an old phrase. I'm talking about podcasts. I'm talking about websites. I'm talking about YouTube. There isn't a limit. So on a TV program, Channel 4 News, we'd have 54 minutes. A newspaper, you have 32 pages. There's just a limit, and you have a word limit. And what's nice is with the podcast, for example, there was no limit on the episodes. They'd say, look, this episode can be 20 minutes or 30 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever it merits. With the book, had a minimum number of words, but there was no sort of maximum. There was no sort of guidelines. You can just tell it for as long as you need to tell it. And that's what's nice about these new types of media compared to more traditional things, TV broadcast, newspapers, etc. I mean, we get told your package is 2 minutes, 45 seconds. And you'd say, can I have another 5 seconds? That would be the thing. I need 5 more. Can I have 5 more seconds? That's how rigid some of those older media are. They're good. They get audiences, but they're constrained.
Right. Fabulous. Well, look, this has been absolutely fascinating. Before I let you go, tell us a little bit. Remind us what the book's called, when it's out, and then tell us a little about series 2 of the podcast and any other things that you want to plug.
Fair enough. Yes. The book is called The Lazarus Heist, same name as the podcast. It's out on the 9th of June. You can get it everywhere, all Waterstones, Amazon. Bookshop.org is a nice one because bookshop.org, if you order through them, it comes to your local bookstore. So that's nice. They get the money as well. So I always plug them. And Series 2 of the Lazarus Heist podcast is out later this year. We're sort of saying October, but don't hold us to that because, as I say, stuff keeps happening and we are getting the most astonishing. I mean, the interviews we've got and the people we're talking to. After Series 1, I did think to myself, is there a Series 2? What will we do? Bloody hell, no worries on that. I mean, there's so many crazy... It goes in so many weird directions.
You're not Alan Partridge. You're good to go with Series 2, right?
We are good to go with Series 2, yeah. It's great. It's gonna be good.
That presumably is keeping you incredibly busy. Is there anything on the horizon beyond that, or is this is like enough to be getting on with?
I'm pitching another book. I'd like to do another book after this, and the book I'm fascinated by and I really want to write is about money laundering, focusing on money laundering. Because, I mean, if you listen to the Lazarus Heist, what you'll actually realize is it's 10-episode podcast, that first one, and at least 4 episodes, maybe 5, were about money laundering. And it's the same with the book. The vast majority of this, the cybercrime is just the instant theft. It's then like, how are you going to get your hands on the money? I find that fascinating. And again, go back to my original point, the underworld industries that I talked right at the beginning. Money laundering is an underworld industry. It's well developed, it's well bedded in, well cemented, and it's got fascinating series of operators who link together in really interesting ways. And so that's, for me, that's exactly the kind of thing I like to investigate. So hopefully I can write another book on that.
Amazing. And look, I think that will be of tremendous interest to many listeners on the show who work in kind of compliance and various other functions that deal with that issue. And what I think is interesting about what you've just described is that whenever banks, for example, do training, they try and make it relevant and sort of try and give you pictures of people carrying briefcases full of money. I think what your investigation does is pulls out some really interesting things that will grab people's attention. And so I think there's not just a ready market for the book, but I think we should get you involved in some of you should be doing training videos for people to talk about how this stuff works, because the theory of it is quite formulaic.
Yeah.
But actually, when it comes down to the practical details of how do you really do this?
Yes.
That's very, very human, requires ingenuity, as you say, requires scale, a whole different ballgame. It's
always stories, that you can't make. For me, I am almost pathologically incapable of thinking in the abstract. I only ever care about things, that's concrete, cemented things that have actually happened in the world, and cases and instances. So apologies if you ever chat to me, and talk about something, I'll say, well, give us an example. I'm always the person that give an example, because that's when, you can imagine it, you can picture it. Oh, I can imagine these people doing this. Human beings connect with stories. It's how we've shared knowledge. Prior to us writing things down, it's how we shared knowledge. Even then, we started writing things down. You use a story. You have a victim and a villain, and then you have a hero, and that's how we share that's how we've shared information and shared knowledge and shared stories for millennia. That's not going away. And so, you've got to get that compliance stuff through. You've got to get the points through. But the best way to do it is through an ABC story, and ideally one, as I say, with a victim, a villain, and a hero.
Love it. On that note, Geoff, thank you so much. One, for the work that you do, right? Because
thank you.
I find myself, take this the right way. I read it and I've more questions in a good way, and more curiosity, more desire to learn. And so the podcast was addictive listening. I know the second series is going to be amazing because you wouldn't be back unless there was something to pursue. The book's incredible. And so details of all of those things will be available in the show notes. But all that remains is to say thank you so much, not only for the work that you do, but also for being an amazing guest on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Geoff for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about the Lazarus Heist book and podcast, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To be notified when new episodes of the show appear, do subscribe to the Human Risk Podcast newsletter. Details of that are also in the show notes. If you're interested in finding out more about the work that I do with my clients, bringing behavioral science to ethics and compliance, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe, keep your data secure, and thanks for listening.